My name's Gavin Rees, and I work for the Dart Centre for Journalism and Trauma. And we've got a panel of speakers. It's a bit bigger than it looks, because we have two people hiding remotely. So I'll introduce them in a little while. So we have Juliana Rufus and Christina Lamb, and unfortunately, Juliana tested positive for COVID, and so I'm sure she'll say herself that she's very sorry not to be here in the room with us all, and Christina has preparations to make to going to Ukraine. So obviously this is the big story that we're all absorbing at the moment, the big conflict-related sexual violence story. And what we're going to do today is to present a new resource. But first of all, if we can have the slides up very quickly. Don't worry, this isn't going to be death by PowerPoint. It's just a few slides to set a framework for the conversation. So as I said a second ago, I work for the Dart Centre for Journalism and Trauma. And if you don't know about us, I'd really encourage you to go and check out the website. And there are lots of resources. You might be doing a story about domestic abuse. You might be working in a local newspaper covering trauma and tragedy. You could be an investigative journalist who's working in an environment of threat. And somewhere hidden in that website are a whole bunch of resources. There are thousands of contributions from journalists and filmmakers around the world, about 20 years of work. But anyway, very recently, a group of us created this resource, which is purely dedicated to covering conflict-related sexual violence. Now, when I say purely dedicated to covering conflict sexual-related violence, even if you're not reporting on that, you might find this resource very useful for covering interpersonal violence of different kinds. Really essential if you're doing any work on torture. And the point behind this is it's the first resource that's ever been created, or we've created, that's deliberately trauma-informed and goes into an awful lot of details about understanding trauma. So in a second, we're going to start a conversation, and the conversation is going to be very open, but it's a very unusual thing, because we're actually giving you all the information we're going to talk about, and an awful lot more in this resource. All you have to remember is the URL, which is coveringcrsv.org. And it's split up into separate sections. Like, we're going to talk about preparation. What do I need to think about if I'm going into the field? Making good decisions about safety. Is this the right time to be interviewing this person? Is he or she the right person to speak to a journalist right now? How do we assess their safety? And it's got all kinds of other things as well about trying to create an environment that creates safety, creates emotional stability for somebody when they're talking about very threatening, very difficult, very personal details. How do we do that as reporters? Yeah, and as you can see, there's some propositions and a lot more detailed resources and various bits and pieces. And also it's available as a PDF, so you can download the whole thing and get the book. Anyway, if we can stop the slides and go back to the screen so we can see all of us together. So the people in the room and our big sisters, I guess. It's like a big brother on the screen behind us. Are we up? Not yet. Waiting for that to patch through. Great. So there's Juliana Rufus. So let me introduce Juliana first. Juliana is a filmmaker, journalist, and also a creator of various cunning, interactive, game-style journalism projects. And she's been working since the beginning of Al Jazeera, for Al Jazeera in different capacities. And for a long time, she was senior producer on their People and Power series, in which she made, I think, over 50 films of different types. And Juliana is a member of the Dart Centre Europe board, a trustee, somebody who's been very close to the Dart Centre, working. We do a lot of professional outreach as an organisation with working professionals, and Juliana has been spearheading kind of network activities and bringing people into a broader conversation. She's also a fellow on the Harvard University Global Trauma Program and was a Dart Center Ockberg Fellow. And let me switch now to Josephine Schmidt, who also has an equally long career covering, I should have mentioned, sorry, I forgot to say something about Juliana. Obviously, she's been working on conflict-related sexual violence, and a lot of the award-winning films that she's worked on have been about things to do with sexual trafficking. She made a wonderful film about women from Nigeria who were trafficked into Italy, which some of you may have seen. And in the room with me now is Josephine Schmidt, and she's executive editor of New Humanitarian, which is a news website that's dedicated to covering humanitarian crises. So lots of societies that have been racked with conflict-related sexual violence over the years and have continuing problems both with the aftermath of that and also with sexual exploitation in different formats. And prior to that, if I'm just a few, we don't want to go into everybody's deep biographies and in too much detail, but Josephine also has worked at the New York Times and has had a very interesting career working in a sort of journalistic developmental context. So we've worked with one of the first training organizations that set up training in the post-Soviet space. So that's Ukraine and other countries, and also worked with Transitions Online. I hope I got all that right.
Whose editor is here?
His editor. Great. Good to have... it's Jeremy. Hello, Jeremy. Good to see you there. And without further ado, Christina, I hope you can hear us in London. So Christina Lamb is a multi-award-winning journalist. Multi-award-winning journalist, who's also written 9 books, and she started out at the tender age of 22, reporting from Peshawar, and had made her name for herself originally as an expert on Afghanistan. And she's written books that you may have seen or read, I Am Malala, The Girl from Aleppo, and more recently, which is directly central to this conversation, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, What War Does to Women. And Christina is also an Ockberg Fellow and somebody who's been closely involved in the creation of these guidelines. In fact, Christina was the chief animating presence, along with another woman called Leslie Thomas, in encouraging the Dart Center to put some time and effort into creating these. And so she's been a real evangelist for the need for us to think a bit more deeply, think a bit more carefully about what we're doing when we're working with very vulnerable people in conflict-related settings. So Christina, if we can start with you, why did you think this was an important project to work on? Why did we need these guidelines?
Thanks, Gavin, and so sorry not to be there. I'd love to have been there. Unfortunately, I had a family tragedy, so I had to be here for a funeral. So otherwise I would have really enjoyed being with lots of other fellow journalists. I thought, so I mostly cover conflict as a foreign correspondent, and I've always been particularly interested in what happens to women in war. But in recent years, it seems to me that I've been covering much more of the brutality that happens in war, which is the rape and sexual violence. It just seems to me to be happening on a much bigger scale. And so I started to become very interested and angry actually about why this was happening and why nobody was doing anything about it, and started researching it more and traveling around the world interviewing survivors, which is what I made my book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefields, from. But in the process of doing it, it became clear to me that we as journalists are often the very first people to interview some of these really deeply traumatized people, and we don't have any training for it. I mean, we're not therapists, we're not psychologists, and we can do a lot of damage to these people if depending on how we handle these interviews. And there are also legal issues too, that if we write about people, we're all interviewing the same people and tell their stories slightly differently, it can make it very hard for them to actually get any justice for what happened to them, because defense lawyers can then easily just pick apart what they've said. So then I met Leslie, who Gavin talked about, who'd made a wonderful film called The Prosecutors, and she felt the same thing in her dealings. So we started to talk to survivors about how they felt about us and how we could interview them in a better way that would be better for everybody. So that's how this really came about.
Great, thank you for that intro. So, I mean, I guess our perception collectively was that no journalist or filmmaker wants to do a bad job. Everybody wants to, nobody wants to cause unnecessary extra harm or distress. But there are lots of things that can go wrong, and lots of things that we need to think about carefully before working in conflict-related sessions. So, are we interviewing the right people? Are we interviewing the same person too many times? There are all kinds of things that need to be thought about. So, Christina, before we go on, I was just wondering whether you have any thoughts about particular things that you thought that maybe could have been done better.
Yes, I mean, one of the problems is that most of the survivors I spoke to said to me that they want to be able to tell their stories in the way they want, where they want, how they want, and over the amount of time they want. And of course, we journalists are usually in a hurry. So it was fine for me in a book form, but if you're on a deadline and you need to get a story across, then that can be quite tricky. I think there's the whole issue of consent that, we ask people, obviously, if they mind us using their story, if we mind them being photographed. And in these cases, I think that's, something to be very wary of. And asking, if they mind their names being used. And there's a real issue about informed consent. People might agree without actually realizing that once they've done that, these days their name or picture could be everywhere on the internet. So I think it's really important to explain to people what it means to have their name there. And also, is it necessary to keep getting people to tell the same story? And I've had situations, for example, with the Rohingya, where many of the women and children who fled, lots of the women talked about having been gang raped by Burmese soldiers and really horrific stories. But there were lots of competing aid agencies working with the Rohingya, and some of those aid agencies were literally coming to journalists like me that were there and sort of saying, oh, I've got a really good rape victim, like kind of competing with. And I think you also have to be aware, do those people, if you've been taken to them by an aid agency, are they speaking because they feel they've got to, because the aid agency is going to help them? And so I think there's a lot of things to think about. Also, who else is in the room when they're speaking? Is it an aid worker, or is it somebody that might somehow use the information over them? So it's really important that people are comfortable about the setting. And the other message that came over again and again was people felt they didn't just want to be their trauma, that they wanted to be presented as a person with wishes and dreams and a life, not just something terrible had happened to them.
Right, okay, thanks so much. Those are things I'm going to pick up as well, very important themes. But I'm wondering, so Josephine, you're an editor, so you're really, you're not necessarily where it completely starts. So say, for example, there's somebody in this room who hasn't reported on this topic before, and they come to you and they want to do, a piece of consequential reporting on a very important matter. What do we mean when we talk about preparation? What preparation has to happen before anybody gets anywhere near the topic?
hear, are we on or not? Are you serious? Sorry. First off, thank you so much for having the New Humanitarian here, and thank you for these guidelines. They are guidelines that we have shared with our reporters and will continue to share with our reporters. As Gavin mentioned, we're a small nonprofit newsroom. We focus on covering humanitarian crises around the world, and that means we cover many conflicts throughout the crisis continuum. So from emerging conflict to the midst of conflict to when there is so-called peace, and a whole period of healing and resilience. In the midst of that, we come across many, many situations where there has been sexual violence, oftentimes in displacement situations where people are living in displacement camps, almost all the time, of course, where there's a really deadly, violent mix of poverty, power, and sometimes really a whole new aid economy that has sprouted up. I'm just curious, before I answer your question, how many of you guys who are out here are reporters? Great, not a ton of you, but great. Well, glad to see you. And also, I assume many of you are editors or producers. And I ask because I think that when one is starting out to even think about doing a story that involves speaking with survivors of sexual violence, it has to be, there need to be questions on both sides. On your side as a reporter going out there, on the editor and the publisher's side as well. And the reason for that is are two really crucial issues, which, as Christina mentioned, consent and also privacy. How do we ensure privacy for the sources of these stories, both while you're interviewing and when the piece is published, but long, long after? And yes, that circles around consent. You know, when we're talking about asking for consent, we're not asking, can I talk to you now? Can I tell your story? Can I take your photo? What we are also asking is, can we contact you in the future? If we contact you in the future, would you want to be contacted if we could give you information about benefits for survivors? Would you want to be contacted if we can give you information about filing a formal grievance? And when you start that line of questioning, you then need to think, okay, if we're contacting you, how do we contact you? Who controls the method of contact? You know, you can have someone's WhatsApp, but that doesn't mean that he or she is the only one with that. So it's just, we have the luxury of being more of a slow news organization. So when we are going to embark on a story where we're speaking with survivors of sexual trauma, we spend a lot of time doing what is really analogous to a risk assessment, but is a whole reporting plan where we ask all of these questions. And you know what? We really hope that the reporters are asking us questions too, such as, how are you going to distribute this story? What is the impact you're looking for? How are you going to get it?
So let's just pick up very quickly on that issue first, the kind of risk assessment thing. So lots of us, or journalists here who've been working in difficult places, will be very familiar with a personal risk assessment. So they're going through a process of thinking about their own safety. But actually, we're also talking about the necessity of doing a risk assessment on behalf of the contributor, not for their entire life, but just for the fact that they're going to be in a production or in a piece of journalism. And so what are some of the things you might think about, actually technical, procedural things you might think about in terms of that kind of risk assessment?
Yeah. Well, if we're talking very technical and procedural, we need to start thinking about how are you going to refer to the people who you're interviewing? Are you going to have their names somewhere? How are you going to secure that? When you give documents to us, when you share documents, we much prefer that you have woman 1, woman 2, woman 3, because if we're sharing documents back and forth, we don't want to invite the opportunity for names or personal information to to come out. It's also really important for you as a reporter, and my reporter colleagues can speak to this better, to really understand the power dynamics of the situation. So why is this person talking to you? How did this person come to you? What do they expect? Are they being sort of served up as an example? Are they doing this because, as Christina mentioned, they think it will ensure aid or more aid? And how can you make clear to them what they can expect from a conversation with you? You know, for us, we are very clear in saying, you are telling us your story. We will help make your story public. We cannot make you any promises that this will bring you more aid, that this will bring justice of any sort, etc.
So thank you for that. Just to give like a kind of short example of how things can go wrong. There's the appalling situation of Yazidi women who were forced into sexual slavery by ISIS and other groups in Iraq, Syria, Kurdistan area. And a lot of them appeared to be willing contributors. And so interviews were arranged by powerful people in the local community who said, it's fine, you know, it's fine for you to interview this person. She's happy and prepared to talk about her experiences. But what the journalists going into the situation didn't necessarily didn't understand was that politically a determination had been made in the community that it would be fine to sacrifice the honor of these particular women for the greater cause of bringing wider international political engagement in the trouble. So these women were deeply shamed. If they had children, they wouldn't be able to return to their communities. And so all of the details about their lives were circulated in a way that was very destructive. And so that's one thing definitely to look out for. I guess the other thing we're thinking about in terms of preparation are also the question of psychologically, am I prepared for this? You know, do I have the skills I need in order to interview people kind of sensitively and effectively? And do I understand the material that I'll be working with? So Juliana, how do you think about the first steps of making sure you're in a good place to do these stories and to kind of head out and report?
Hi everybody, and I too am really sorry not to be there in person. But yes, thanks for having me on the panel. I think what is so useful about the website is that even though there's a strong focus on sexual violence, it gives a minimum understanding of what trauma is. And sort of leading on from what Christina was just now saying, that a lot of people who've lived through a traumatic event, including sexual violence, are actually okay to speak. And research shows that the fear of re-traumatizing people for an interview, for example, is not always justified. People are okay to speak. A lot is about how the interview is conducted. And this also speaks to what Josephine just touched on, understanding power dynamics. And with regards to trauma, the power dynamic is mostly that somebody who's gone through a traumatic event such as rape has lost control in a situation. So the single most important thing, and for me this is a real takeaway from trauma-informed journalism, is the single most important thing is that we can try and conduct interviews in a way that gives control back to the people who've lived through a traumatic event, such as women who've suffered sexual violence. And there really are sort of some pretty simple steps to remember, which is about maximizing permissions. That's on our side as journalists, asking for permission. So asking them, and because it's not just that we do it in the right place and in the right way, but it's also putting the person back in control. So for example, where would you like to be interviewed? So some people want to be interviewed in the open, for example, because they have had a terrible experience in a closed room. Other people want to be in a closed room so that not everybody can listen in. We can ask, who do you want to be present during the interview, and not presume that everybody who is present is actually there for a reason. I mean, somebody may have just turned up and we don't understand that the interviewee doesn't want the person there, which sort of also refers to the power dynamic that Gavin just spoke about of Yazidi women being sacrificial lambs for greater good. It's really important to ask people if there's anything that they may not want to speak about, and to understand that it's important not to break through barriers, that if you are in an interview and you come up against something and you have this feeling that this person doesn't want to talk. I mean, I had that in the context of the film that Gavin just mentioned with Nigerian women trafficked into Italy. I was interviewing a woman and I could not understand how she was getting from Libya into Italy. And luckily I had this understanding that if there seems to be a barrier, it's there for a reason, let me not push it. And afterwards somebody said that on top of all this other trauma of rape and so on, that this woman had suffered through her rubber dinghy sank. And that was the one thing she could not speak about. And I was told that afterwards. So it's this awareness, barriers are there for a reason. It's us being okay as journalists with deep listening, being okay with silences, and if something uncomfortable comes up, that we don't have this urge to fill the space because it is uncomfortable. Try and not probe why questions, why did you walk this way, and why is that you can easily sound like an interrogator. So maybe have a choice of other questions, and then also brief the crew or the translator in the same way. And maybe one last point about how to finish an interview. So sort of we can think of it maybe in 3/3. One is preparing the interviewee for the interview and then going through the actual story. And the last third is really making sure that we don't let the interviewee hanging in the past, that we take them back out of whatever terrible thing they've gone through and we bring them back into the present. That can either be something sort of really basic, whatever, take them back into the present, it's a beautiful day today, but something that I much prefer is actually making them the expert and to say, is there anything that you've learned from this experience, or what would you advise other women who are in your place? Because most people have learned something, and this puts them into a place of learning and resilience, which we know is something that really protects against trauma and re-traumatizing.
Great, thanks very much for that. And so this idea of maximizing permissions, I think, is really helpful. And we can also do it on a micro basis, like almost a kind of almost invisible basis, really. If you ever see a fantastically skilled trauma clinician talking to somebody, they might pepper their conversation with little, is it okay if we talk about? Do you mind if we talk about? So this continual process of asking permission and trying to work out where somebody is. And then another thing about this is people are often very polite. So when journalists ask them questions, they have a big desire to answer them. And sometimes people might be pushing through their comfort barrier, getting very, very tired, and find it quite difficult to tell the journalist or the filmmaker that. So it can be quite a good thing at the beginning of an interview to ask somebody, to acknowledge this is going to be could be a really challenging conversation. We're going to be talking about things that I know are very difficult for you. When will I know when you need a rest? You will tell me, won't you? If you're feeling a bit tired and you want a bit of a break, just tell me, that's fine. There's nothing that you have to speak about. We can stop at any time. And also a thing about kind of open questions and a kind of creating a space. So rather than asking really, as Juliana was saying, asking really specific questions like what happened on the boat, something along the lines of, what can you tell me about the crossing? Which is a very open way, and then people can decide where they feel safe and secure. Christina, you've had a lot of experience working in other countries and employing local journalists and translators. Is there anything that we need to think about in terms of working with people? How do we deal with the translation issues and using the wrong words and all that can happen in that process?
Yeah, actually, just picking up from what Juliana was saying, we also need to think about the translators' well-being. And sometimes, I had a terrible experience with talking to some Yazidi women, and I had a male Yazidi translator, And he'd been very involved in helping me set up the interviews and everything, so I hadn't really thought much about the effects it would have on him, I have to say. And so, because he was all part of it and trying to rescue women, and so I just didn't think about that. And then we did very harrowing interviews for a day, and then he told me afterwards that he'd been vomiting all night because he was so upset about the interviews. And then it turned out that his own girlfriend had been abducted and had actually committed suicide. I didn't know any of that. I was so horrified and felt so bad when I knew that. So I felt like I'd made him kind of relive, although he was a sort of activist, and so I, not. But I think it is important to just make sure that the people that are translating for you are comfortable, to keep asking them if they're okay as well. And I really agree with Juliana and you about keep asking people, is it okay to keep, and to just, constantly be making sure that people don't feel pushed.
Great, thanks. So I think there's a bit more about language and the choice of words. So in a second, we'll come to Josephine. But Juliana, one thing I think we haven't really explored is, in enough detail yet, is the whole idea of consent. What does it really mean to, so somebody says yes, they're happy to speak to this nice journalist. Maybe they say that on camera or on audio tape, and so surely that we've ticked the box, haven't we? Or is there some stuff we've missed out?
I don't know how many people in the audience speak English, but the English expression for consent, so for getting somebody's agreement, is that we don't just need the agreement, but we need consent. It's called informed consent. And the idea of informed is that people actually really understand what they're saying yes to. And as you say, we've touched on it, both Josephine and Christina. It's people understanding how long. Firstly, that if we record them, that this recording may be up for a very long time, that it may be reused in ways that we don't understand. It may end up being on social media in really terrible situations. It could become a meme, and it can be distorted, and also it lives on mobile phones. I mean, I know that from productions that have taken place in African villages, where villagers felt it was okay to say yes to a white crew because the crew came from a faraway broadcaster that was making big news that nobody in the village would ever see, because they were on television. And of course the world isn't like that anymore. The next thing you know, it is on somebody's mobile phone. So informed consent is really about making people understand what can be seen, read, or heard. And also, if we agree to disguise somebody's identity, to be really clear about how much we have to disguise it. And especially, I know that from stories about rape, where a TV crew that I know went through a disguise of somebody who participated very carefully, but had not understood that the person was actually most worried about a family finding out. And of course the family can read anything, language, shape of a person. So maybe then that means, not so much maybe in conflict areas, but an actor. So it basically, it sounds like this idea of consent is a complete millstone. And once we've asked or we've explained to a potential contributor what could happen, everybody is bound to say no, which is actually not my experience. My experience is that if I've been very open, some people say no, and maybe then that's also a good thing, because the problems that could come in the long run with somebody not understanding consent could be terrible. I mean, I know, again, from a production where there was a suicide attempt, and obviously, that's the worst possible scenario. But I think there is a sort of an aspect to informed consent that people don't think about, that it's also a way of building trust. that when you address the elephant in the room, that when you can say, I understand why you may not say yes to this interview, and you could be worried about this or you could be worried about that, there's often a sigh of relief that this issue is out in the open, and it's the first step of building trust. And it can actually mean that somebody starts and decides to participate because they feel you're in dialogue with them about how best to do this.
Great, thank you, it's really helpful. So Josephine, people read their stuff, so choices about language are very consequential. What do we need to think about in terms of making appropriate language choices and working with people?
Yeah, sure, I will.
Oh, sorry, your mic.
It's okay. Well, there's so many levels on which we can talk about language. Just briefly, to go back to the idea of consent, we had an email 2 weeks ago from a woman who was interviewed in 2009 for a story about she had been kidnapped, taken as a wife of a militia leader in Congo, et cetera, and in this story, her name was used, her photo was used. It had been on our site since 2009. So we got an email saying, could you please take this down? That she hadn't understood how the information would be used. She thought it was going to be used for research. She didn't know it would be public. And that now her children were old enough to go online, and when they put her name in, this is what came up, a story about their mom who, at the age of 12, being kidnapped, being a child bride, et cetera, et cetera. And she said very clearly what was going to happen had not been explained to her in her language, which I think is really important to think about when you are on the ground, when you are working with a translator and with local journalists, to really have some ground rules about how are you going to get consent, and further, really to have some ground rules around a lexicon. So then to move over to language choices, we had an experience a few months ago. We've been doing a lot of reporting in the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh. And in looking back on transcripts, we realized there were, in several interviews with the same translator, there were so many instances of rape from the same person all over and over again. And when we went back, what we found out was this translator was using the word rape to mean any sort of touching, to mean any sort of violation. And that really was on us, that we had not sat down with this translator and really worked out a lexicon and guidelines for, in English, this is what we mean by this word, that word. So just making very clear about how language is to be used. And then there's the whole other level of when we are presenting the story, how do we use empowering language that is empowering to these survivors, that does not automatically tell a story of gloom and doom. No, these stories are not bright, but our feeling is that these women, they are usually women, are courageous in telling these stories. So let's highlight that courage. Let's not automatically throw out a line where they are victims forever. So we do that often in very simple ways. We recently, not so recently, last year, we were doing some reporting in Burkina Faso, and as you probably know, there have been huge spikes in displacement there and sexual violence along with this displacement. And there were sex for food schemes going on in some of the displacement camps. There had been so many people displaced. There were many ad hoc camps. And when we first got the story in, it set the scene, talked about how these women had fled in terror from Islamist militants, found this camp, and thought it would be safe, and then they were faced with this. But in fact, if you think about it, these were women who were able to take their kids. They were able to figure out how to escape, and that's a different thing than fleeing in terror. So just by making that simple change, to us, it felt so much more respectful and really so much more powerful as a story.
Great, thank you, thanks. So Christina, you've also been thinking a lot about how do journalists write about the worst things that happen to people, at the same time as preserving a space for dignity, recovery, and a future. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, but also just, to go back to this whole issue of consent, there's been a case, I'm sure a lot of people might be aware of a film that was made about the Yazidis that was quite high profile, and then women afterwards said that they had never given consent, and there was clearly, the director said there was clearly a misunderstanding of what this was going to be used for. So I think, it's a really thorny issue. You have to be very, very careful. And personally, I'm quite concerned about some of the things that are appearing on social media from Ukraine. As we know, it's been horrendous reports from Ukraine of some of the rapes by Russian soldiers, but things are appearing that are showing people's identity. Now people might feel at the moment, because they are angry at what's happening in their country and they want to come forward and they feel it's a sort of act of patriotism. They might not feel like that in a few months or a few years that their name was out there. So I really feel, if it's not, it's easier being in print, of course, but if it's not necessary, then, don't identify somebody. It doesn't really make a difference to the reporting. But some people, do want to be, and actually, when I wrote my book, a lot of the people wanted to be, and they were people that were actually taking legal action, so they were already out there and felt quite angry about what happened and want to change things. So, some people definitely do want to, and like specifically asked to be named. I think there's a real issue of photography, which we haven't spoken about, which is very fraught. I worked with a photographer in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is, there is a big problem of sexual violence and also a lot of children. And we were in a hospital where a 6-month-old baby and a 4-year-old girl brought in, and it was horrific, who'd been raped. And the photographer took pictures now and asked the family if it was okay to use them. I think there is no circumstance where it's okay to use pictures like that. I wasn't very aware of those conversations. And of course, when we published the story, we didn't use those pictures, but the pictures were out, existed, and suddenly appeared on social media not very long ago. So I was quite furious when I saw that. The photographer told me that she had entered them in a competition and put a note on it that these are not to be published. And then that she'd come second in the competition and they had published the pictures. If you can't really expect other people to, you should basically not be putting those photographs ever out anywhere. But to say, oh, well, I put on them that they shouldn't be published, but you entered them into a competition. So I think that's very, a very important thing to think about. And now I've completely forgotten what your actual question was, Kathy.
Yeah, no, it's fine. So it was a broader question. We've already actually touched on it in talking about choices with photos. But it's really the question is, how do we tell these stories without reducing people just to the worst things that happen to them, and what's our responsibilities?
I think a lot of it is talking to people about their lives, what they want to do, what they did before, what they hope to do in the future, and so that they're actual people, not just that most terrible day in their lives. And everybody I spoke to really emphasised that they really wanted that to come across. And frankly, it's better for readers or viewers, I think, too, to know a bit more about the person than that. And, to hear, I think it is also quite important, so I can't remember now if it was Juliana or Josephine who said that, about not leaving people in the past, but talking to them about, more actively about what is helpful for them, what they want to do, what might be useful for other people, because, really at the root of all this, I think, is justice and bringing justice. And at the moment, we're really failing to do that. And so, people talking about that and the best way to get justice is actually incredibly useful for all of us.
Right, great, thanks so much. I think I'm going to ask Juliana to talk a bit more about, and it also goes very much to what Christina was saying as well, about the translator who was carrying a heavy load into an interview. And one of the things that the guidelines are very adamant about is that we must also think about our self-care in the context of doing a good job and turning up in a fit state to interview people. And Juliana, I wondered if you had thoughts that you could share on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is what the Dart Center speaks about a lot. Sorry, can you turn me down? Because I've got an echo. I know you can make that go away. Thank you very much. So we know from trainings that we do at the Dart Center that journalists often feel somewhat guilty about looking after themselves and making sure their own well-being is on the agenda, because so many people, and I think all of us in the panel, have worked in or are working in places where people really live in terrible conditions. So there's this whole sense of, is it not indulgent if I make time for myself or if I prioritize my fitness? But for me, I work with a really amazing clinician, psychologist sometimes at the Dart Center, and she has a really simple image, and it is that in an airplane, you're being asked in a threatening situation to put your own oxygen mask on before you save somebody else. And I like that image because it is very visual, and really what it says is look after yourself, and if you do, you can do your job better, and you can give better assistance to somebody else, or do a better craft, is really what I'm saying in our case as journalists. Because often employment is precarious, people are freelancers, the deadlines are not always reasonable, and then of course you deal with stories that have a lot of really difficult content, and then there's lack of sleeping and so on. So really, I guess the message is that it's in our interest in terms of craft and being better journalists and being smart and picking up on things and responding to cues and conducting better interviews, to look after ourselves, but also obviously in the interest of the people that we work with, because we recognize much more if somebody's in distress, and maybe we should change the way the interview is being conducted, or we need to take somebody back into the presence. And I think Gavin may give some more tips. I'm going to stop here because I know we're nearly running out of time, so you can do the next bit if you want.
Yeah, no, thanks, yeah. Again, it's something that's already been mentioned, is that if we're talking about really challenging things and topics with somebody who's courageous enough to share those experiences, we have to learn how to be good hosts to that information. And that might involve sitting with their distress as it comes into us. So when you really connect to somebody, or you're really listening to somebody, and you're practicing empathy, that involves opening a bridge up to some degree. And what happens is that emotions can come back across that bridge. So you could be sitting in front of somebody, hearing their story, and maybe they feel a profound sense of shame, and you could find that shame also comes across the bridge into one. And so trying to get a better understanding of trauma, educating oneself, putting in proper time to kind of process this information and be mindful and reflective about what's going on is a really important part of self-care. And the risk otherwise is that maybe we become jaded, burnt out, cynical, slightly dismissive perhaps of hearing people. Maybe we could find ourselves ranking different individuals' pain. This person is complaining about this, but that's nothing compared to the story I heard last week. And so staying in tune with our own emotions is a very important way of creating a safe space for somebody else so that they feel secure. We also talked about listening a lot, which is so important, listening, because it creates a virtuous circle. If somebody feels that they're heard, they relax, the interviewer relaxes, then the interviewee picks up on that, and then they relax, and we can create a place where these terrible things can be heard if we're careful. Self-care, though, isn't just... we're going to create a little bit of space for questions, but I just wanted to bring Josephine into this quickly, because self-care isn't just about intrepid reporter or filmmaker looking after himself or herself. It's also an organizational responsibility, don't you think?
Yes, I absolutely think so, and at the New Humanitarian, that's one of our principles. I think for all of you out there who are reporters and also editors, if you are pitching a story and if you are thinking of working with an organization, really talk to them about what do they feel their responsibility is to this story, and how will they stay with it. I mean, it is one thing to have harrowing testimonies, which will bring in tons of clicks. It's another thing to move forward from those testimonies and look at what brought us to this situation. What can we do to ensure that we're not in this situation again? And it's also, as a media organization, we feel very strongly that we want to bring the reporting back to the communities that we have reported from. So if you're doing a story, who will receive it? Who will be the audience? Will the communities you've reported from receive it? We spent, in fact, 2 years doing an investigation in Congo, speaking to more than 80 women and uncovering a Sex for Jobs scheme that was part of the Ebola response. We ensured the privacy of all of those women, had to find ways to make this story come alive visually without photographs. We used illustrations. We had a voiceover artist, a Congolese voiceover artist, speak some of the testimony so that you could really hear these women's words. To us, one of the most heartbreaking things was we couldn't use their names. It wasn't safe to use their names. But that was that's all they had left for many of them, their names. So we wanted at least for their words to go out there. But one of the reasons we did that too was so that we could then package this and go to larger media organizations that could pick up these stories and make sure that these women weren't sharing their stories for nothing, that they would be heard. And we translated into French, and we translated the audio into French. So, what is the really distribution, and really what it is moral responsibility of the organization you're working with once you bring these stories in.
Right. I think theoretically we weren't supposed to ask questions, but I think it would be lovely to. So we've got a few more minutes, and if there's a couple of questions, that would be great. And I think somebody in the front row. So if you shout out your question in a COVID-safe way. No, I'm joking, you can shout out your question. Yeah, sure, go. Yeah. Great. So I'm gonna just so that everybody else can hear. I'm just going to summarize the question, which is really where are there? How do we create spaces to increase journalists' capacity to report more effectively on these kinds of stories? And so, Juliana, maybe you can pick up on that.
Yeah, I will come back, of course, to the Dart Center with that, because this is one of the things we are doing. So on various levels, there are trainings and seminars which have come a bit to a halt, at least the ones in person, because of COVID, like so many other things. But we've got what we call network meetings on Zoom, where we talk about that, but also at conferences such as Perugia, much more structured events. And one of the things that we're working on at the moment, and we hope that this will get wider distribution, is the idea that actually journalists can offer a lot of peer support to each other, and that this helps a lot. So it's partly about exchanges of information and being at home in a community of journalists that is really concerned about best practice and having support from fellow journalists of, you know, doing these difficult things. Not every editor is as understanding as Josephine, and not every organization. A lot of what Josephine said was really thoughtful, but sometimes you just get pressure from above, and then, you know, it's about journalists supporting each other about how to have a conversation with editors about this. And going forward, what we're actually trying to set up in Germany, and this is a project in the pipeline, and then hopefully also to scale, is a peer support helpline for journalists, where journalists are being trained to give peer support to each other, and we're trying to get that funded. And then there is a whole training peer support element in it that would amplify these sort of conversations.
Okay, thank you, great. Can I ask one more question? Can we have one more question? Yeah. We have no time. Just a minute. A very quick question. Is there a very quick question? No? Yes, so there was a hand there, right at the back, blue mask. Can you take your mask off? Sorry, I can't hear. Yeah, Josephine, maybe you could pick up on aftercare.
Sure. After we publish the story, we have the luxury of often going back and continuing with the story. One issue that we are looking at very seriously is justice, because, yeah, there are every so often big headline-breaking stories about, say, sexual abuse by peacekeepers, etc., and then you never hear anything ever again. So we feel it's our responsibility to, if we are bringing these testimonies out into the world, to try to follow through. Do we stay in touch with the sources? Sometimes. Sometimes it's not safe to stay in touch with the sources. Yeah. I would just like to mention one thing on the topic of, well, yes, of aftercare and of self-care. We have a fantastic essay on the new humanitarian.org by an Ethiopian journalist, a woman who has been covering the conflict in Tigray, and she's writing about the psychological toll of covering sexual violence in conflict, and I would really recommend you take a look.
Right. I'm getting, I was going to say, I'm getting very nice looks from the back of the room. So I think that unfortunately has to be it. And so you can find me and Josephine in the bar or wandering around somewhere. If you've got any questions, you can ask us. Don't forget, this is a tale of two websites. There's the dartcenter.org website, and there's the coveringcrsv.org website. Everything we talked about, plus loads more are there. Unfortunately, Juliana and Christina, we can't meet in the bar afterwards, but they can be found occasionally in bars around the world. And I'm sure if you say, oh, I saw you on the big screen in Perugia, and I've got this question, I've been waiting 5 years to ask it, I'm sure both of them would be very keen to reply. And we're a network. We're here to improve the quality of journalism. And so do stay in touch with all of us in any way you can. And I'd like to thank Juliana, Christina, and Josephine for giving her time and their insight into this very, very important topic. Thanks so much to all of you as well for coming.